The village of St. Mary Mead had always possessed the curious ability to appear perfectly tranquil at precisely the moments when it was least so. On the afternoon of the annual harvest and horticultural fête, the church lawns spread beneath a pale September sun in an arrangement of such innocent charm that no stranger could have imagined malice existing within several miles of it. White canvas stalls fluttered gently in the breeze. Rows of jam jars gleamed like stained glass upon trestle tables. Children chased one another around the yew hedge, while elderly ladies in hats of uncertain age dispensed sponge cake and opinions with equal liberality. Miss Jane Marple, seated in a wicker chair near the tea-tent, observed it all with mild blue eyes that missed remarkably little. "You see," she remarked delicately to Miss Eyes, "Bantry, one always knows beforehand which fête will end badly." Mrs. Bantry, who had been reaching for a second seed-cake, paused midway. "My dear Jane, what an alarming thing to say! It is merely experience." Miss Marple folded her hands neatly atop her handbag. "There is generally some tiny indication, a sort of moral draught in the atmosphere." Mrs. Bantry looked about her with interest. "I feel nothing at all except a draught from the lemonade stall." "That," said Miss Marple, "is because you are sensible enough not to concern yourself with human nature?" Mrs. Bantry laughed. "My dear, human nature is the only thing anyone in this village does concern themselves with." This, unfortunately, was perfectly true. Across the lawn, Colonel Melchette argued loudly over the judging of marrows. Near the rose competition, Miss Hartnell was whispering to the vicar's sister with the concentrated pleasure of a woman imparting scandal under the guise of concern. The younger villagers moved in smaller, sharper groups, all bright lipstick, bicycles, and private tensions disguised as gaiety. At the centre of it all stood Mr. Alistair Wren. He was not a native of St. Mary Mead. That fact alone had interested the village from the beginning. Mr. Wren had arrived 18 months earlier and purchased Rosebank Cottage as a handsome Georgian house with neglected gardens and an unfortunate history of damp. He was perhaps 45, dark-haired, though already silvering slightly at the temples, and possessed of the easy manners that village people instinctively distrust. He was charming to women, courteous to tradesmen, and vague about his past, which was in St. Mary Mead practically an accusation. He was in the diplomatic service, Mrs. Price Ridley had declared confidently. "Nonsense," said Miss Hartnell. "He's clearly theatrical." "Gamblers often have excellent manners," observed Mrs. Bantry now, following Miss Marple's gaze. "My dear Dolly," said Miss Marple gently, "you say that because of your cousin Archibald. And I was perfectly right about Archibald." Mr. Wren, meanwhile, appeared entirely unaware of the speculation he inspired. He moved pleasantly among the fête-goers, pausing to compliment cakes, purchase raffle tickets, and exchange easy conversation. Yet Miss Marple watched him thoughtfully. Not because there was anything obviously wrong about him, because there was something practiced. It was rather like watching a cat sit beside a goldfish bowl while pretending not to know what goldfish were. "You've gone quiet," said Mrs. Bantry. "I was remembering someone," said Miss Marple. "A curate in Much Benham. Such delightful manners. He embezzled a coal fund." Before Mrs. Bantry could respond, there arose near the flower stall a small disturbance. A woman had arrived, not the sort of arrival that involves noise or announcement, rather the opposite, the sort that subtly alters the atmosphere merely by occurring. She was perhaps 35, elegantly dressed in dark green, carrying a black umbrella despite the fine weather. Her face was pale beneath her hat, and there was about her an unmistakable air of strain. Miss Marple noticed immediately that Mr. Wren had stopped smiling, only for a fraction of a second, but long enough. The woman approached him directly. They exchanged a few words too quietly for others to hear, though several villagers strained hopefully in that direction. Then, unexpectedly, the woman handed him the umbrella, not casually, deliberately. Mr. Wren stared at it. Even from across the lawn, Miss Marple saw something alter in his expression. Pure and unmistakable. "How very odd," murmured Miss Marple. Mrs. Bantry leaned forward eagerly. "What is—" "The umbrella." "The umbrella?" "Yes." "One usually opens an umbrella when one intends to use it." Mrs. Bantry blinked. "Well, naturally. But neither of them has." Indeed, the umbrella remained tightly furled. The woman said something else. Mr. Wren replied sharply. Then she turned and walked away across the lawn toward the lane beyond the churchyard. Mr. Wren did not follow. He remained standing motionless beside the jam stall, holding the umbrella as though it was something unpleasantly alive. The fete continued. Tea was poured. Raffle numbers were called. Colonel Melchett continued to protest the Marrows. Yet beneath the ordinary surface of things a peculiar uneasiness had begun spreading quietly outward like ink in water. Miss Marple observed that Mr. Wren soon disappeared from the fete entirely. So, a little later, did the umbrella. By 6 o'clock the weather had changed. A grey wind swept across the village, rattling leaves along the high street. Most people had gone home by then, though knots of villagers still lingered discussing prizes and grievances. Miss Marple walked slowly toward her cottage, carrying a small basket of unsuitable vegetables won in the raffle. Near the gate of Rosebank Cottage she paused. The garden gate stood slightly open. Nothing remarkable in that. Yet Miss Marple found herself looking again. There are some houses, she often thought, that seem capable of announcing trouble before one even enters them. Rosebank Cottage possessed that quality now. The curtains downstairs were not drawn despite the failing light. One upstairs window stood open, banging faintly in the wind, and upon the gravel path near the hydrangeas lay the umbrella, still unopened. Miss Marple frowned. At that precise moment a scream shattered the evening quiet. It came from inside the house, not a theatrical scream, not prolonged, merely one short, involuntary cry of terror. Miss Marple moved surprisingly quickly for a woman of her age. The maid from next door came running through the hedge almost simultaneously, white-faced and breathless. "It's Mr. Wren," she gasped. "Oh, Miss, something's happened." By then several others had arrived from the lane. Doors opened up and down the street. Voices rose in confusion. Miss Marple entered the cottage hall quietly. The smell met her first, not blood. Burnt almonds. In the drawing-room Alistair Wren lay dead beside the fireplace. A shattered glass rested near his hand, and standing over him in rigid horror was the woman in green. She looked up as the others crowded in. "I didn't kill him," she said at once. No one answered, because on the table beside the body lay a small bottle labeled cyanide, and beside it, absurdly neat amid the chaos, rested the unopened umbrella. An hour later the drawing-room was full of policemen, whispers and rain tapping steadily against the windows. Inspector Slack had arrived from Much Benham, bustling with official certainty. Dr. Haydock stood near the mantelpiece looking grave. The woman in green had given her name as Mrs. Lydia Harrow. Nobody in St. Mary Mead had ever heard of her before that afternoon, which naturally made her guilty in the minds of half the village immediately. "She admits they quarrelled," whispered Miss Hartnell excitedly from the doorway. "She came straight here after the fete," murmured Mrs. Price Ridley, "and no one knows who she is." Inspector Slack, overhearing, nodded with satisfaction. "A very straightforward matter, I should say." Miss Marple, seated quietly in a corner, said nothing. Her eyes rested on the umbrella. Rainwater dripped slowly from its tip onto the carpet, yet something about it disturbed her profoundly. Not merely that it had remained unopened, but that everyone seemed determined to ignore it entirely. And that, Miss Marple reflected, was very often the most dangerous kind of clue. By breakfast the following morning St. Mary Mead had reached its conclusions. The remarkable thing about English villages was not that gossip travelled quickly, but that it travelled with such astonishing confidence despite possessing almost no reliable information whatsoever. Mrs. Finch at the post-office declared firmly that the dead man had been engaged in foreign business. The butcher believed him to be a smuggler. Miss Hartnell, who considered intuition superior to evidence, announced that Mrs. Lydia Harrow was that type of woman. No one defined precisely what type that was. No one needed to. Miss Marple, seated by her window with a piece of needlework untouched in her lap, listened to these reports with polite interest as they arrived one by one through callers, tradesmen, and accidental conversations conducted deliberately near her gate. She observed privately that murder excited people very much in proportion to the dullness of their ordinary lives. Her maid Florence entered carrying tea. "They've taken that lady to the vicarage, miss." "Indeed? Inspector Slack says she's not under arrest exactly, but she's not to leave the village." Florence lowered her voice. "They say poison was found on her gloves." Miss Marple accepted her tea calmly. People frequently say things before breakfast that become impossible by luncheon. Still, she was thoughtful after Florence left. The previous evening lingered vividly in her mind, the fat lawns growing grey beneath the approaching storm, the strange exchange of the umbrella, and above all the expression on Alistair Wren's face when the woman had handed it to him. Not anger, not surprise, certainly not affection, fear of a very particular kind. Miss Marple threaded her needle absently. There were many kinds of fear: fear of exposure, fear of violence, fear of disgrace, fear of losing money. But the fear she had seen in Mr. Wren resembled something older and deeper: recognition. Like a person unexpectedly confronted by something he had hoped never to see again. A brisk knock interrupted her thoughts. Colonel Melchett entered without waiting for permission, as was his habit. "Well, Jane," he announced, removing his gloves, "nasty business. Slack thinks he'll have it wrapped up within the day." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Inspector Slack often enjoys wrapping things up." The colonel grunted. Woman had motive enough by the sound of it. Turns out she knew Wren years ago. Did she indeed? Met in London, apparently. Money involved. "Money is so often involved," said Miss Marple sadly. "Even when people insist it is love." Colonel Melchett accepted tea with the satisfaction of a man who believed civilization depended entirely upon it. "There's another odd thing," he said presently. "No one can find the servant." "Servant?" "Wren's man. Ellis. Fellow's been with him about a year." Miss Marple looked up. "Oh!" "Gone completely. Vanished sometime yesterday evening." "That is curious. Slack says it probably means nothing." Miss Marple gave a small cough which concealed a smile. "Then it may be extremely important." Colonel Melchett laughed loudly. "You always did dislike policemen." "Not at all. They are extraordinarily useful. One always knows precisely which facts they will overlook." The colonel leaned closer. "You've got an idea, haven't you?" "My dear Colonel, at my age one accumulates ideas in the same unfortunate way one accumulates rheumatism. The difficulty is determining which are serious." But after he left, Miss Marple sat quite still for several minutes. Then she rose, put on her gardening shoes, and walked slowly toward Rosebank Cottage. The house possessed that peculiar stillness common to places where death had recently occurred. Not silence exactly, rather an absence of ordinary life. The front gate stood open. 2 constables moved about importantly inside. Rain had left the garden glistening and untidy. Wet roses drooped heavily over the gravel paths. Inspector Slack emerged from the front door as Miss Marple approached. "Morning, Miss Marple." "Good morning, Inspector." He looked faintly wary. Most policemen eventually did. Miss Marple had a distressing tendency to notice things before they did. "Terrible affair," she remarked. "Very straightforward." "Yes," said Miss Marple gently. "Those are often the most deceptive." Slack ignored this. "We've established the dead man drank poisoned sherry around 6:30. Mrs. Harrow admits she visited him. They quarreled violently. How unfortunate. She claims she left him alive." "And did she?" Slack frowned. "You mean, is she telling the truth?" "I mean precisely what I said." The inspector shifted impatiently. There's no evidence anyone else entered the house." Miss Marple's eyes wandered toward the umbrella now standing in the hall stand inside the open door. "No?" "No." "And the umbrella? What about it? You have examined it?" Inspector Slack looked surprised. "It's only an umbrella." Miss Marple said nothing. A silence followed. It was one of Miss Marple's most effective weapons, silence gently applied until other people felt compelled to fill it. Slack eventually shrugged. "Nothing suspicious about it." "Was it wet?" "Of course it was wet. It rained." "Yes," said Miss Marple softly. "But not when Mrs. Harrow handed it to Mr. Wren." The inspector blinked. "Well—" "It remained unopened all afternoon." "What difference does that make?" "My dear Inspector, objects usually have purposes. When people refuse to use them for those purposes, one ought to wonder why." Slack stared at her uncertainly. Then he laughed. "You village ladies do enjoy mysteries." "Yes," said Miss Marple, "though unfortunately murder is not really mysterious at all, merely human." As she turned to leave, something near the hedge caught her attention. A trampled flower bed. Nothing dramatic, merely disturbed earth beneath the hydrangeas. But Miss Marple paused. "Have you searched the garden thoroughly?" "Certainly." She bent slightly, examining the mud. 2 sets of footprints had crossed there recently. One heavy, one considerably lighter. The lighter prints led toward the side gate. The heavier ones did not return. "Inspector," she asked quietly, "did Mr. Wren own a gun?" Slack looked surprised again. "Why?" "No reason." But her eyes remained thoughtful. The Bluebird tea-rooms that afternoon resembled a parliament of anxious sparrows. Every table hummed with speculation. Miss Hartnell sat rigid with excitement. "I always distrusted him," she declared. "Far too charming." Mrs. Price Ridley nodded vigorously. "And secretive. People who are secretive," announced Miss Hartnell, "generally have secrets." Miss Marple, stirring tea peacefully, said, "Sometimes they merely have relatives." No one listened. At the next table 2 younger women discussed Lydia Harrow in lowered tones. She looked absolutely desperate. Well, naturally, if she poisoned him. But why carry an umbrella all day without opening it? Miss Marple's spoon stopped very slightly against the china. The second woman shrugged. "Perhaps it was broken." "No," said Miss Marple suddenly. Both women looked startled. "My dear," Miss Marple continued apologetically, "forgive me, but the umbrella was not broken." "How do you know?" "Because Mr. Wren was frightened of it." An awkward silence followed. Then Miss Hartnell gave a nervous laugh. "My dear Miss Marple, surely not literally frightened of an umbrella." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "In my experience, objects are rarely frightening in themselves. It is what they represent." And privately she thought, "or conceal." For one detail persisted in troubling her more than all the others. If Lydia Harrow had intended murder, why announce herself publicly at the fete first? Why place herself beside the victim before half the village? It lacked caution, and murderers, however emotional, were usually cautious about at least one thing: themselves. Outside, rain drifted softly across the village green, and somewhere beyond the windows of the tea-room, unseen by any of them, a man in a dark coat stood watching St. Mary Mead with careful attention before turning quietly away down the lane. Miss Marple had often observed that people who lied successfully rarely invented extravagant falsehoods. Instead, they omitted, they forgot, they remembered selectively. It was therefore with particular interest that she listened the following morning while Inspector Slack explained, over somewhat overboiled tea at the vicarage, that Mrs. Lydia Harrow's account of her acquaintance with the late Mr. Wren was perfectly straightforward. "She admits they knew each other years ago in London," said Slack. "Apparently there was once an understanding between them." The vicar's wife gasped gently. "A romantic understanding?" Slack looked uncomfortable. "Well, possibly." Mrs. Clement adjusted the teapot with renewed fascination. "And then, according to Mrs. Harrow, Wren disappeared suddenly. Went abroad. She hadn't seen him for nearly 15 years until yesterday." Miss Marple, who sat knitting quietly near the window, asked, "And what brought her to St. Mary Mead now?" Slack hesitated. "She says she received a letter." "From Mr. Wren? Do you have it?" "She claims she destroyed it." "How unfortunate," murmured Miss Marple. Slack frowned. "You think she's lying?" "My dear Inspector, I think everyone lies a little. It is merely a question of why." The inspector shifted irritably. "She admits they quarreled about money. Did she specify the sum?" "No." "Or the reason?" "She says Wren owed her an explanation." Miss Marple nodded softly. The inspector looked at her sharply. "What does that mean?" "Women," said Miss Marple, "seldom travel to villages carrying emotional grievances after 15 years unless the matter concerns either betrayal or fear. Often both." Mrs. Clement looked impressed. Slack looked annoyed. Well, she had opportunity enough. No one else entered the house. Miss Marple did not answer immediately. Her needles clicked gently together. Then she asked, "Has anyone identified the poison bottle?" "Chemist's stock. Ordinary enough. And fingerprints?" "Wren's and Mrs. Harrow's." "Only those?" Slack hesitated again. "A partial Miss Marple's knitting stopped. "How interesting. It proves nothing." "Perhaps not." Yet her eyes became thoughtful, because smudged fingerprints, Miss Marple reflected, were frequently more revealing than clear ones. People accidentally left fingerprints. Smudges suggested wiping, and wiping suggested fear. After luncheon, Miss Marple walked slowly toward the high street. The village appeared outwardly unchanged. Chickens scratched behind hedges. Bicycles rattled past, shop bells rang cheerfully. Yet beneath the ordinary rhythms of village life there pulsed the quickened excitement of scandal. Doors opened more quickly than usual. Curtains moved. Conversations paused abruptly as one approached. Murder, Miss Marple thought, was rather like throwing a stone into a pond. The disturbance traveled outward in widening circles, revealing things previously hidden beneath calm surfaces. She paused outside the post office where Mrs. Finch immediately beckoned her inside with poorly concealed eagerness. "Such dreadful news, Miss Marple. They say that woman may have had another name once." "Indeed?" Mrs. Finch lowered her voice. "A gentleman from Much Benham asked whether anyone remembered a Miss Lydia Gray." Miss Marple looked mildly surprised. "And did anyone?"
"Well—"
Finch admitted reluctantly, "No." That must have disappointed him. Mrs. Finch leaned closer. There's more. Colonel Melchett says Mr. Wren wasn't really called Wren at all. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened very slightly. Oh? They found papers upstairs. Another name entirely. What name? Mrs. Finch looked triumphant. Valentina. Miss Marple repeated it softly. Valentina, an unusual name, memorable. And suddenly something stirred faintly at the edge of her recollection. Not a memory exactly, an association. She thanked Mrs. Finch and continued thoughtfully along the lane. Valentine. Where had she heard it before? Not locally. London, perhaps, or in connection with. Her thoughts broke off as she nearly collided with Dr. Haydock emerging from the surgery. Ah, Miss Marple. Just the person. You look troubled, Doctor. I am. He glanced around before lowering his voice. The timeline bothers me. In what way? Wren died sooner than he should have. Miss Marple regarded him steadily. That sounds significant. The poison acted unusually fast, almost immediate collapse. Yet according to Mrs. Harrow, he was perfectly normal when she left him. How long afterward was he discovered? Approximately 15 minutes. Miss Marple folded her hands upon her umbrella. So either Mrs. Harrow lied about the timing, or someone else entered afterward. Dr. Haydock nodded grimly, but Slack refuses to consider it seriously. Yes, said Miss Marple. Inspectors prefer doors that remain politely shut after they've reached conclusions. The doctor smiled despite himself. There's another thing. Yes? The dead man had been ill recently. Not seriously. Nervous symptoms, lack of sleep, digestive trouble. Fear? Suggested Miss Marple quietly. Dr. Haydock looked startled. Well, perhaps. Miss Marple thanked him and resumed walking slowly homeward. Fear again. Always fear. Not the sudden fear of murder. The chronic fear of expectation, of waiting. And then she remembered. She stopped so abruptly that a passing bicyclist nearly struck the hedge. Valentine. Years ago. A story mentioned in an old newspaper at the lending library in Much Benham. Not murder. A financial scandal involving a man named Charles Valentine who had vanished before charges could be brought against him. Miss Marple stood very still. People did not usually vanish unless they believed the future held something worse than disappearance. And if Alistair Wren had once been Charles Valentine, then perhaps Lydia Harrow had not come to extort him. Perhaps she had come because she was afraid of him. That evening rain battered the windows of the Bantrys' drawing-room while a small gathering discussed the case with determined solemnity. Mrs. Bantry adored solemnity when accompanied by cocktails. "It's all perfectly dreadful," she declared happily. "Colonel Melchett snorted," she declared happily. "Colonel Melchett snorted. Slack's bringing charges tomorrow." Miss Marple looked up sharply. "So quickly? Case is obvious enough." "Is it?" The colonel frowned. "My dear Jane, woman quarrels with victim, poison found, fingerprints everywhere." "Yes," said Miss Marple softly. "Almost too accommodating." Mrs. Bantry leaned forward eagerly. "You think someone arranged it?" "I think," said Miss Marple carefully, "that murderers are often untidy emotionally but remarkably tidy practically." A log shifted in the grate. Rain hissed softly against the glass. Then the maid entered carrying a salver. A message for Miss Marple. Miss Marple opened the folded note. There were only 6 words written in hurried pencil. "Ask about the umbrella handle." No signature. Mrs. Bantry peered curiously. "What is it?" But Miss Marple was no longer listening, because suddenly she realized something astonishing. Throughout the entire investigation, everyone had discussed the umbrella itself. No one had asked what might be inside it. And at that precise moment, somewhere in the darkness beyond the warmly lit windows of Gossington Hall, a figure stood watching the house with cold and patient attention. Miss Marple slept very little that night, not because she was frightened. She had long ago observed that old age altered one's relationship with danger. Young people feared violence because they imagined life stretching indefinitely ahead of them. Elderly people, having seen enough sorrow already, tended instead to fear foolishness. And someone, Miss Marple was increasingly certain, had behaved very foolishly indeed. The anonymous note lay upon her bedside table. "Ask about the umbrella handle." Nothing more. No signature. No explanation, which, naturally, made it important. At 7:30 the following morning she was already in her garden clipping dead roses, when Inspector Slack appeared at the gate looking tired and damp. "I might have guessed you'd be up," he said. "My dear Inspector, old ladies and birds are alike in one respect. We both wake unnecessarily early." Slack managed a brief smile. Then his expression darkened. "There's been another incident." Miss Marple laid down her scissors carefully. "Monsieur Harrow." "No." "Wren's missing servant." "Ellis?" "He's been found." The pause that followed told its own story. "Dead?" asked Miss Marple quietly. Slack nodded. "In the woods near the old quarry." "How dreadful!" "Shot through the chest." Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly. That explained the footprints in the flower bed, and perhaps several other things besides. "Was it suicide?" she asked. Slack snorted impatiently. "Hardly. Gun missing. Then someone silenced him." The inspector looked uncomfortable. Miss Marple studied him gently. "You are beginning to doubt your straightforward case." Slack removed his hat and ran a hand through thinning hair. "The timing's wrong now. If Ellis was alive after Wren died, then besides, Harrow may not have been alone in the house after all." Miss Marple said nothing. One must never interrupt a policeman while he was painfully approaching intelligence. Slack continued. "There's something else. We examined the umbrella properly this morning. The handle unscrews." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "Indeed, there was a compartment inside." "Empty?" Slack frowned. "You knew?" "But I suspected concealment of some sort." The inspector shifted awkwardly. "Well, it may not matter. Could have contained papers, or money, or something much smaller," said Miss Marple softly. Slack stared at her. "What do you mean?" But before she could answer, another figure appeared at the gate. Mrs. Bantry, breathless, excited, and carrying scandal with the efficiency of an express train. "My dear Jane-O, Inspector." "Morning." Mrs. Bantry lowered her voice theatrically. "The village is buzzing. Apparently Mr. Wren wasn't merely a criminal." "No," said Miss Marple mildly. "There are rumors about espionage." Slack groaned aloud. "Absolute nonsense." "Possibly," agreed Miss Marple. "Though villagers always prefer spies to accountants. It sounds more romantic." Mrs. Bantry ignored this. "And that woman, Lydia Harrow, has barricaded herself in the vicarage bedroom. Poor Mrs. Clement says she hardly slept." Miss Marple became thoughtful. Fear again. Everywhere fear. Not merely among the innocent, among everyone, which suggested a very particular kind of crime. An hour later Miss Marple paid a quiet visit to the vicarage. Mrs. Clement received her gratefully. "My dear Miss Marple, perhaps you can persuade her to eat something. She is distressed?" "Terribly." Mrs. Clement lowered her voice. "And frightened out of her wits." Miss Marple nodded. "That seems understandable." Lydia Harrow sat near the bedroom window overlooking the churchyard. Daylight revealed the strain in her face more clearly now. She looked exhausted rather than dramatic, a woman worn thin by years of anxiety. When Miss Marple entered, she rose immediately. "They think I killed him." Miss Marple took the offered chair calmly. "I didn't. I believe you." The younger woman stared. "You do?" "My dear, murderers nearly always behave selfishly afterward. Your concern appears directed elsewhere entirely." For the first time emotion broke visibly across Lydia Harrow's face. "He told you things, didn't he?" Miss Marple asked gently. A long silence followed. Then Lydia said quietly, "You know who he really was?" "Charles Ballantyne." The woman closed her eyes briefly. "Yes." "Why did you come to St. Mary Mead?" Lydia clasped her hands tightly together. "Because I received a letter." "The one you destroyed?" "Together. Because I received a letter." "The one you destroyed?" "Why destroy it?" "Because I was afraid."
"Of what?"
Lydia looked toward the closed door before answering. Charles had enemies. Miss Marple waited. "Years ago," Lydia continued slowly, "he worked for a financial firm in London. There were accusations, missing money. But it wasn't only that. No? He became involved with people who used information for political purposes. Espionage." "I don't know exactly." Her voice trembled. "I truly don't." Charles always knew dangerous men. Men who smiled too much. Miss Marple thought privately that dangerous men very often did. "The letter asked you to come here?" "Why?" "He said he was frightened. He wanted to give me something for safekeeping. The umbrella." Lydia nodded. "He told me never to open it." Miss Marple's eyes rested quietly upon her. "And did you?" "No." "Not even after his death?" A flicker of hesitation. Tiny, but enough. Miss Marple said softly, "You did open it." Lydia pressed a hand suddenly against her mouth.
"Oh, God."
Please tell me the truth." The younger woman began trembling visibly. There was a key inside. "A key? What sort?" "I don't know." "And where is it now?" "I took it." "Why?" "Because before I could decide what to do." She swallowed painfully. Someone entered the house. Miss Marple became very still. "I don't know." "I heard movement in the hall. I panicked and hid in the study." "What happened then?" "The man searched the drawing-room. He was looking for something. The umbrella contents." "Did you see him clearly?" Lydia closed her eyes. "Only briefly." "But—" "He knew the house well." Miss Marple leaned back thoughtfully. "Alice," she murmured. "What?" Lydia stared at her. "You think?" "I think," said Miss Marple carefully, "that servants notice many things, particularly frightened servants." A terrible possibility had begun forming itself in her mind. Suppose Alice had discovered whatever Valentine concealed. Suppose someone else knew he had discovered it. Then the murders were not about revenge at all. They were about retrieval. Miss Marple rose slowly. "My dear Mrs. Harrow, I must ask you something extremely important." "Yes? Where is the key now?" Lydia hesitated. Then, very quietly, she said, "I no longer have it." Miss Marple felt the first genuine chill of alarm. "You lost it?" "No." "Then who has it?" Lydia's face had gone completely white. "I think," she whispered, "the man who killed Charles took it from my handbag at the vicarage yesterday afternoon." Outside, church bells began ringing faintly across the village. Calm sounds, ordinary sounds. Yet Miss Marple suddenly understood with complete certainty that the murderer was no longer merely covering old crimes. He was searching for something still hidden, and very likely willing to kill again to obtain it. The difficulty with danger in villages, Miss Marple often reflected, was that it persisted in occurring among people one had known for years. In London, murder might arrive respectably disguised as a stranger. But in villages it generally sat beside one at church socials, borrowed garden shears, and asked after one's rheumatism, which made it considerably more alarming. Miss Marple returned from the vicarage deep in thought. The matter of the key altered everything. If Lydia Harrow spoke truthfully, and Miss Marple believed she did, then the killer had not merely murdered Charles Valentine. He had searched for something afterward with cold and practical determination. Not a crime of passion, a crime of necessity. And necessity, Miss Marple knew, was often far more dangerous. She had just reached her gate when Florence hurried toward her looking unusually excited. "Miss Hartnell's here, miss." "Indeed?" "She says it's urgent." Miss Marple suppressed a faint smile. In St. Mary Mead, Miss Hartnell considered nearly everything urgent except actual emergencies. Inside the drawing-room, Miss Hartnell sat bolt upright upon the sofa, clutching her handbag with grim importance. "My dear Miss Marple," she announced immediately, "I have remembered something extremely significant." "How fortunate," said Miss Marple, removing her gloves. "Memory is such a blessing when accurate." Miss Hartnell ignored this entirely. "It concerns the ferret." "Yes?" "That woman, Lydia Harrow, was not the only person speaking to Mr. Wren before he disappeared." Miss Marple sat down quietly. "Go on." "There was a man near the bookstall." "What sort of man?" "Ordinary-looking." Miss Marple concealed resignation. Witnesses invariably describe murderers as ordinary-looking unless they happen to possess green whiskers. "Tall?" she prompted gently. I think so." "Dark?" "Possibly." Miss Marple waited patiently. Miss Hartnell frowned with enormous concentration. "He wore a brown coat." At least, Miss Marple thought, humanity remained consistent. There are rather a great many brown coats in England. "Yes, but this one was shabby." That improved matters slightly. "He spoke to Mr. Wren only briefly," Miss Hartnell continued. "But afterward Mr. Wren looked upset. More upset than after speaking with Mrs. Harrow." Miss Hartnell blinked. Miss Marple became very attentive. "Are you certain?" "Quite certain." "Did Mr. Wren appear angry?" "No." Miss Hartnell hesitated. "Frightened?" Again that word. "Always fear." Miss Marple folded her hands thoughtfully. "Did you recognize the man?" "But afterward I saw him again near the church gate." "Doing what?" "Watching." Miss Marple looked up sharply. "Watching whom?" "Everyone." A silence followed. Then Miss Marple said gently, "My dear Miss Hartnell, you may actually have observed something useful." Miss Hartnell flushed with gratification. "I knew it at once." That, Miss Marple thought privately, was certainly untrue. Inspector Slack proved less enthusiastic. "A shabby fellow hanging about a ferret?" he repeated skeptically. "Could have been anybody. Miss Marple sat opposite his desk at the temporary police office in Much Benham. "Village ferrets attract all sorts." "Indeed they do," Slack sighed. "You think he's connected?" "I think frightened men seldom become more frightened after trivial conversations." The inspector shuffled papers irritably. "We already have a timeline. My dear Inspector, timelines are like railway schedules. Extremely comforting until something derails." Slack looked at her suspiciously. "You've got another theory." "I have several. That is the difficulty." He leaned back. "All right, then. What troubles you most?" Miss Marple considered. "The murders themselves." "Murders?" "Yes, plural. Wren and Ellis." "Quite?" Slack frowned. "What about them?" "They are different." "How do you mean?" "Mr. Wren died quietly by poison. Ellis was shot." "Well—" "Different temperaments." The inspector stared blankly. Miss Marple sighed gently. "Poison is intimate, Inspector. Often personal. Shooting is hurried. Practical." "You think two different people killed them?" "No." "Then I think the same person behaved differently under different pressures." Slack was silent. Then reluctantly, "Go on." "Mr. Wren's death was planned carefully. Ellis's death was not. Ellis became dangerous unexpectedly. Because he knew something?" Slack rubbed his jaw thoughtfully. "You may have a point there." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "One must encourage policemen when they approached intelligence voluntarily. There's another matter," she continued. "The umbrella." "Oh, Lord." "You still consider it unimportant. It's an umbrella with a hidden compartment." "Yeah." "But why use such a thing at all?" "For concealment." "Precisely. Which means Mr. Wren feared being searched." Slack looked suddenly alert. "You think he carried documents, or objects small enough to hide? The missing key? Perhaps." The inspector stood abruptly and crossed to the window. "We searched Rosebank Cottage again this morning. There's a locked cabinet in the upstairs study." Miss Marple's knitting paused mid-stitch. "Locked. No key fits it. Slack turned. "If the missing key opens that cabinet, then someone is very anxious to obtain it before the police do." The inspector's expression darkened. "And Lydia Harrow says the key was stolen yesterday, meaning the killer may already have it." Miss Marple did not answer, because another possibility had just occurred to her. Suppose the killer had searched Lydia's handbag and failed to find the key. Suppose Lydia still possessed it unknowingly, or had hidden it herself in panic and forgotten. Fear made people astonishingly careless. That evening a thick mist settled over St. Mary Mead. Lights glowed softly behind curtained windows. The village lanes grew hushed and silver-gray beneath the drifting fog. Miss Marple, returning from evensong, walked slowly with her umbrella tucked neatly over one arm. Near the churchyard gate she became aware of footsteps behind her. Not close. Careful. Following. She continued without altering pace. At her age, sudden movements only encouraged rheumatism. The footsteps remained steady. Miss Marple turned down the narrow lane beside the old rectory wall. The footsteps followed. Then, quite deliberately, she stopped. "So very unpleasant," she remarked aloud. The footsteps halted too. Miss Marple did not turn around immediately. "People who follow elderly ladies generally underestimate them," she continued conversationally. Then a man's voice said roughly, "You should leave this alone." Miss Marple turned. The figure stood half concealed by mist beneath the trees. Dark coat. Hat pulled low. Ordinary looking. "How interesting," said Miss Marple calmly. "You don't understand what you're meddling in." "No," she agreed. "Not completely. But I generally find murder objectionable regardless of context." The man took one step nearer. "You're in danger." "My dear sir, everyone is in danger constantly. Most people simply avoid noticing. Listen to me." But suddenly another sound interrupted him. A bicycle bell approaching through the fog. The man glanced sharply toward it, and in that instant Miss Marple saw something important. Not his face. His limp, very slight, yet unmistakable. Then he turned and vanished quickly into the mist beyond the churchyard. A moment later the bicyclist emerged, young Jimmy Corral, delivering evening papers. "Evening, Miss Marple." "Good evening, Jimmy." The boy pedaled on cheerfully into the fog. Miss Marple remained motionless beside the gate. Not severe, but familiar somehow. And then, with sudden clarity, she remembered where she had seen it before. Not at the fete, at Rosebank Cottage. Ellis, the missing servant, had limped slightly when carrying coal buckets from the yard. Miss Marple stood very still indeed, because either a dead man had just threatened her in the fog, or someone in St. Mary Mead had been pretending to be Ellis long before the body was discovered. Miss Marple did not mention the matter of the limp to anyone immediately. This was partly because experience had taught her that policemen disliked theories involving dead men walking about in fogs, and partly because she distrusted conclusions formed in dramatic circumstances. Mist had a habit of enlarging impressions. Nevertheless, she slept badly. By morning the village was buzzing again, for news had spread that the dead servant found near the quarry had not, in fact, been identified with certainty until late the previous evening. That detail interested Miss Marple profoundly. It was astonishing how often people identified bodies not from evidence but from expectation. A dead man wearing a servant's coat naturally became the servant, especially when everyone already believed him missing. Miss Marple arrived at the Bluebird Tea Rooms shortly before 11 and found Inspector Slack waiting there with visible impatience. "You've started something," he announced. "How gratifying. The quarry body may not be Ellis after all." Miss Marple stirred sugar into her tea calmly. "No? The face was damaged by the fall. We relied mainly on clothing and build. And now?" Slack lowered his voice. "Dr. Haydock examined the hands more carefully this morning." Miss Marple looked up. "Yes?" No servants' calluses. A silence followed. The clatter of cups and cheerful village conversation continued around them absurdly unchanged. Miss Marple said quietly, "Then who was he?" "We don't know." Inspector Slack sat heavily opposite her. "And Ellis has disappeared completely." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "So the dead man at Rosebank Cottage feared someone. The missing servant knew something dangerous." "Yes, and now an unidentified man has been shot wearing Ellis's clothing." Slack looked miserable. "Exactly." Miss Marple regarded him kindly. "You are no longer enjoying your straightforward case." "No." "That is usually the first sign of progress." The inspector ignored this. "There's worse." We opened the locked cabinet upstairs. "With the missing key?" "No, locksmith." Slack hesitated. It was empty. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "Entirely?" "Except for dust." That, she thought, was extremely suggestive. Empty locked compartments nearly always meant one of two things. Either something had recently been removed, or someone wished others to believe something had recently been removed. "Any marks?" she asked. "What sort of marks?" "Inside the cabinet." Slack blinked. "Well, yes. Circular scratches on the shelf. About this size." He indicated something small with thumb and forefinger. Miss Marple became very thoughtful indeed. Not papers then. Something cylindrical, perhaps, or mechanical, something stored upright. "What did Wren Valentine actually do in London?" she asked. "Financial work mainly." "Only mainly." Slack gave her an irritated look. "There are rumors." "What kind?" "Government contracts during the war." Miss Marple nodded faintly. The war had left England full of men who knew dangerous things and preferred not to discuss them. And such knowledge often aged badly. That afternoon Miss Marple paid a visit to Rosebank Cottage itself. The police presence had diminished slightly now that the excitement of discovery had passed. A single constable remained near the front hall. The house felt curiously abandoned, not merely empty, interrupted, as though its owner had expected to return momentarily and continue some unfinished task. Miss Marple moved slowly through the drawing-room where Charles Valentine had died. The carpet stain had been cleaned imperfectly. Rain-grey light drifted through the windows. On the mantelpiece stood several framed photographs. Miss Marple paused before them. One showed Valentine beside two other men in military uniform many years earlier, all smiling, all young. One of the faces had been scratched repeatedly with something sharp. Not enough to destroy it entirely, merely damage it. Hatred, Miss Marple reflected, often lingered in such tiny domestic gestures. She leaned closer. The damaged man was tall, dark-haired, and standing slightly unevenly. A limp, perhaps? "Interesting," murmured Miss Marple. A voice behind her said, "You shouldn't be here alone." She turned quickly. Lydia Harrow stood in the doorway, pale beneath her hat. "My dear Mrs. Harrow, you startled me." "I'm sorry." Lydia hesitated. "I saw you enter. You wished to speak with me?" Her eyes moved nervously about the room. "I remembered something." Miss Marple waited. "Yes? I lied yesterday." "About still having it?" Lydia nodded miserably. "I hid it." "Where?" "In the umbrella." Miss Marple stared. "But the umbrella compartment was empty." "Yeah." "Because when I heard someone entering the house, I panicked." Lydia pressed trembling fingers together. I hid the key in the umbrella handle and left the umbrella beside the table before hiding in the study." Miss Marple became very still. "And afterward? When the police arrived, the umbrella was still there. But later, you discovered the key gone." Lydia nodded. Miss Marple walked slowly toward the hall stand where the umbrella had originally rested. "So the murderer searched the umbrella after the body was found?" "Which means he remained in the house." Lydia looked horrified. "You think he was there while everyone arrived?" "Possibly." Miss Marple's gaze moved thoughtfully toward the narrow service corridor leading to the kitchen. A house like Rosebank Cottage contained many exits, and frightened people overlook servants' passages surprisingly often. Then suddenly she asked, "Mistress Harrow, did Charles Valentine ever mention a man named Marcus?" Lydia stared. "Tell me. He said Marcus would eventually find him." "Who was Marcus?" "I never knew exactly." Her voice dropped lower. "Only that Charles feared him terribly." "Did he describe him?" "No." "That Charles feared him terribly." "Did he describe him?" "No, but—" "Yes?" He limped. Silence settled heavily through the room. Miss Marple felt a small cold certainty forming itself. Not Ellis, then. Not entirely. Someone else. Someone from before. Someone connected to whatever Charles Valentine had once concealed. And perhaps to the empty cabinet upstairs. A floorboard creaked suddenly overhead. Both women looked up sharply. The house had seemed empty. Miss Marple said quietly, "We are not alone." Another creak. Deliberate. Someone moving in the upper corridor. Lydia whispered. Miss Marple's expression became unexpectedly firm. "My dear, please go quietly through the kitchen and fetch the constable outside. And you? I shall remain here." "You can't." "My age," said Miss Marple calmly, "renders me unexpectedly invisible. It is one of the great advantages of elderly womanhood." Reluctantly, Lydia hurried toward the rear passage. Miss Marple waited motionless in the drawing-room. Above her, footsteps moved carefully across the upper floor, then stopped directly above the locked study. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. The empty cabinet. Whoever remained upstairs had returned for something, or to make certain something was no longer there. A soft sound followed. Not footsteps. Wood sliding against wood. And suddenly Miss Marple realized with complete certainty. The cabinet upstairs was not empty at all. Miss Marple climbed stairs very carefully, not merely because of age, though age certainly encouraged caution upon staircases, but because she had long ago discovered that people moving quietly often heard far more than those moving quickly. Above her the house had fallen silent again, the silence of someone listening. Halfway up the stairs she paused. Rain tapped faintly against the landing windows. Somewhere downstairs a clock ticked with exaggerated loudness. Then came the soft scrape once more. Wood against wood. From the upstairs study. Miss Marple continued upward without haste. One advantage of appearing harmless was that no one expected decisiveness from one. The study door stood slightly ajar. Light from the corridor spilled across the carpet, and inside, kneeling before the locked cabinet built into the wall, was a man in a dark coat. He turned sharply at the sound of her voice. "You are looking in the wrong place," said Miss Marple mildly. For one extraordinary second he simply stared at her, not because she had surprised him, because she had not screamed. He was perhaps 50, heavily built, with iron-gray hair and a tired, intelligent face. His right leg dragged faintly when he rose. The limp. Yet what struck Miss Marple most forcibly was not danger but exhaustion. The man looked like someone who had spent many years waiting for catastrophe and had finally grown weary of it. "You shouldn't be here," he said quietly. "That," replied Miss Marple, "is becoming quite a popular opinion." His eyes flicked toward the staircase behind her. "You're alone?"
"Yes."
"That's foolish." "Probably." The man hesitated. Then, unexpectedly, he gave a short laugh. "Charles used to say old women were the only people who ever noticed anything. Charles Valentine was correct occasionally." The stranger regarded her steadily. "You know who he was, and you know about Marcus. I believe I am speaking to him." A long silence followed. Then the man inclined his head slightly. Miss Marple moved a little farther into the room. The cabinet door stood open now. Inside appeared nothing except shelves and shadow. Yet Marcus had been reaching deep along the interior panel. "A false back," said Miss Marple softly. He smiled faintly. "Very good." "Not really. Village cupboards often have them. One sees the same sort of thing with elderly bachelors' hiding port." Marcus almost smiled again. Then his expression hardened. "Where is the key?" Miss Marple watched him carefully. Not panic, not greed, desperation. "I don't have it," she said truthfully. His shoulders loosened slightly, as though he believed her instinctively. "You're not what I expected. My dear sir, nobody ever is." Marcus turned back toward the cabinet and pressed something hidden inside. A narrow panel sprang inward. Behind it rested a small metal cylinder no larger than a spectacles case. Miss Marple stared. So that was the circular mark. Marcus removed the cylinder carefully. Even now, Miss Marple noticed, his hands trembled slightly, not from age, from strain. "What is it?" she asked. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said quietly, "The reason Charles died?" Downstairs voices sounded suddenly in the hall. Inspector Slack, the constable, Lydia Harrow. Marcus closed his eyes briefly. "Too late. You could surrender peacefully," suggested Miss Marple. He gave her a tired look. "You still think this is an ordinary murder?" "No," said Miss Marple softly. "I think it is a very old fear." Something changed in his expression then. Recognition, perhaps, or relief. "They used us during the war," he said abruptly. "Men like Charles, men like me." Miss Marple remained silent. When it ended, certain documents disappeared. Agreements. His mouth twisted bitterly. People became nervous. "The cylinder contains those documents." A microfilm copy. Miss Marple understood very little about microfilm beyond the fact that modern governments appeared excessively fond of tiny, complicated objects. "And Charles kept it hidden all these years? Why?" Marcus laughed once without humor. "Insurance." Voices were approaching the staircase now. Marcus looked toward the window. "No," said Miss Marple immediately. He glanced at her. "At my age," she continued calmly, "one develops a horror of unnecessary melodrama." For the first time he looked genuinely amused. Then the amusement vanished. "I didn't kill him." Miss Marple believed him instantly. Not because he appeared honest, because he appeared guilty of something else entirely. "What happened that evening?" she asked quickly. Marcus hesitated only a second. "I came to warn Charles." "About whom?" "He'd been seen." People were asking questions again. "The man in the brown coat at the fete." Marcus nodded. "Charles panicked when Lydia arrived with the umbrella, because the key was inside." "And later?" "I followed him home. We argued." Marcus looked away briefly. He drank while we talked. Miss Marple felt the shape of the truth shifting suddenly beneath her feet. "You didn't poison him." "No." Then someone else was already in the house. Marcus met her eyes. The voices had reached the staircase now. Inspector Slack called sharply, "Miss Marple." Marcus moved toward the door. "If they find this—" "They will," said Miss Marple. "You don't understand." "No," she agreed. "But murder remains inconvenient regardless of politics." A faint smile touched his face again. Then suddenly his expression changed completely. He was staring beyond her toward the open study door. Miss Marple turned. A man stood in the corridor holding a revolver. For one absurd instant her mind supplied only a trivial observation. He was impeccably dressed, dark suit, polished shoes, silver tie pin, the sort of man one instinctively trusted with committee finances. Dr. Colwyn Hayter, not Dr. Haydock. Dr. Hayter, the visiting neurologist staying at the old rectory for rest. Miss Marple had met him twice at tea. He smiled pleasantly. "Step away from the cabinet, Marcus." Marcus went utterly still. "So," he said quietly, "it was you." Dr. Hayter's revolver remained perfectly steady. "You should have left England years ago." Miss Marple felt the entire pattern rearrange itself with shocking speed. Not Ellis, not Lydia, not Marcus, the charming outsider doctor with the war connections and cultivated manners. And suddenly she remembered the photograph downstairs, the scratched-out face. Not Marcus. "You poisoned Charles Valentine," said Miss Marple softly. Dr. Hayter sighed almost regretfully. He became unstable. "You mean frightened." He intended to bargain with material that was never his to keep. Inspector Slack's footsteps sounded close now. Hayter heard them too. Everything happened quickly afterward. Marcus lunged. The revolver fired. Glass shattered beside the window. Miss Marple instinctively dropped behind the desk as the two men crashed violently against the cabinet. The metal cylinder rolled across the floor. Another shot exploded deafeningly through the study. Then suddenly silence. Heavy breathing. A grunt. Miss Marple looked up carefully. Marcus stood swaying near the bookshelf, clutching his shoulder. Dr. Hayter lay unconscious against the overturned chair, the revolver several feet away. and in the doorway behind them stood Inspector Slack, white-faced and astonished. For several seconds nobody moved. Then Miss Marple said calmly, "Inspector, I believe your straightforward case has altered somewhat." For the remainder of that afternoon, Rosebank Cottage ceased to resemble a village murder scene and began instead to resemble a disturbed ant-hill. Policemen arrived in increasing numbers. Telephone calls multiplied. Men from London appeared with quiet authority and unsuitable shoes for country mud. Inspector Slack alternated between excitement and wounded dignity, like a terrier discovering it had accidentally cornered a tiger. Miss Marple, having been firmly escorted downstairs for her own safety, sat in the drawing-room drinking tea with Lydia Harrow, while the house trembled faintly overhead from official activity. "My dear," said Miss Marple gently, "you really must stop apologizing." "I brought the umbrella," Lydia said miserably for perhaps the 6th time. "If I hadn't come, something else would have happened." Lydia looked up uncertainly. "You think so?" "My experience," said Miss Marple, "is that people carrying fear for 15 years seldom arrive peacefully at old age." Outside the drawing-room door, voices passed hurriedly along the corridor. Words drifted in fragments. Foreign Office. Security matter. Village murder had become government business. Miss Marple privately considered this rather unfortunate. Government people invariably complicated things. Lydia twisted her handkerchief anxiously. "Will they arrest Marcus?" "I rather doubt it." "You trust him?" Miss Marple considered carefully before answering. "No," she said at last, "but I believe him." There was a distinction. Marcus, she suspected, had spent years engaged in activities that honest people would deplore and governments quietly encourage. Yet he had not possessed the emotional texture of a poisoner. Poison required concealment, patience, a sort of intimate cowardice. Dr. Hayter, by contrast, possessed exactly the smooth self-control that Miss Marple distrusted instinctively. Cultivated men with excellent manners and empty eyes always reminded her unpleasantly of certain churchwardens. The door opened abruptly. Inspector Slack entered looking simultaneously triumphant and overwhelmed. "Well," he announced breathlessly, "that settles it." "Does it?" asked Miss Marple mildly. Slack ignored this dangerous question. "Hayter's admitted knowing Valentine before the war." "Yes. He claims the microfilm contained names of intelligence assets and payment records." "How unpleasant. He says Valentine stole it in 1945. Miss Marple nodded faintly. Such a flexible word, particularly among governments. "And Ellis?" she asked. Slack's face darkened. "We found him?" "Alive?" "Yes," Lydia gasped softly. "Where?" "Hiding in an abandoned cottage beyond Much Benham." Slack shook his head irritably. Man was terrified out of his... Slack shook his head irritably. Man was terrified out of his wits. Miss Marple became attentive. "Terrified of whom?" "Hayter." Inspector Slack sat heavily opposite them. "Apparently Ellis discovered Hayter searching Wren's study 2 nights before the murder, and recognized him. Hayter threatened him into silence." Miss Marple nodded slowly. That explained much. Servants, she reflected, were uniquely vulnerable to intimidation because they witnessed secrets without possessing social authority to speak about them. "And the body at the quarry?" "Another intelligence man." Slack looked disgusted. "Or former intelligence man. Name of Brewer. Shot by Hayter?" "We believe so." "Why dress him in Ellis's clothing?" "To fake Ellis's death and stop us looking for him." Miss Marple folded her hands. "Very sensible." Slack stared. "Sensible? For a murderer. One must always distinguish between morality and competence." The inspector looked uncertain whether this was criticism. "Hayter thought Ellis had taken the key," Miss Marple continued. "When Brewer failed to recover it, Hayter eliminated him and disguised the body." Slack blinked. Yes, that's exactly it." He sounded mildly annoyed that she had solved it before he finished explaining. "But," said Miss Marple softly, "the poison remains." Slack frowned. "What about it?" "You are assuming Hayter poisoned Valentine. He practically admitted it." "Did he?" "Well—" Miss Marple watched him kindly. "People under arrest often accept convenient assumptions if they believe larger matters are endangered." Slack looked suddenly thoughtful. "You think he's protecting someone?" "I think," said Miss Marple carefully, "that Dr. Hayter appears a man who kills efficiently when necessary. Shooting, certainly. But poison... no." Lydia looked startled. "But then who?" Before Miss Marple could answer, the door opened again. Colonel Melchett entered carrying the excitement of the entire village upon his shoulders. "My dear Jane," Extraordinary business. Foreign agents in St. Mary Mead. Apparently. I always said outsiders were unhealthy. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Villagers frequently blamed outsiders for crimes conceived locally. It was comforting, and usually incorrect. That evening the rain finally ceased. Mist drifted low across the gardens of Rosebank Cottage while policemen moved in subdued clusters beneath the trees. Miss Marple stood briefly alone near the hydrangea path where the umbrella had first been found. The gravel still showed faint scars from many feet crossing hurriedly in darkness. She looked toward the drawing-room windows thoughtfully. Something still resisted explanation. Several things, in fact. Charles Valentine had feared Hayter, certainly. Marcus, too. But fear alone did not explain the poison, nor the timing, nor one small absurd detail that continued troubling her more than all the espionage nonsense. The sherry glass? Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly, reconstructing the room precisely as she had first seen it. The body beside the fireplace, the overturned chair, the poison bottle, the umbrella, and the glass in Valentine's left hand. Her eyes opened sharply. Left hand. Yet Charles Valentine had been right-handed. She remembered clearly now. His fountain pen upstairs beside correspondence placed to the right, ashtray to the right, matchbox to the right. People arranged habits unconsciously. So why had the poison glass rested in the left hand? Unless? Miss Marple became very still indeed. Unless someone had placed it there afterward. Not Hayter then. Not Marcus. Someone else had entered the room after death. Someone domestic enough to tidy appearances instinctively. Someone frightened. And suddenly she remembered another thing. At the fete, before Lydia Harrow arrived, Charles Valentine had already looked anxious, after speaking to the shabby man in the brown coat, Marcus. Yet afterward he had remained at the fete calmly for nearly 20 minutes. Only Lydia's arrival truly unsettled him. Not because of the key, because of recognition. Lydia represented his past, and perhaps another person feared that past emerging too. Miss Marple turned slowly toward the servants' entrance at the side of the house. Ellis had not been the only servant employed at Rosebank Cottage recently. There had also been Mrs. Pritchard, the charwoman who came mornings. Quiet, respectable, invisible. Miss Marple suddenly remembered seeing her once years ago in another village, not as Mrs. Pritchard, as Mrs. Valentine, Charles Valentine's wife. Miss Marple had long maintained that the most dangerous people in England were respectable women of quiet habits, not dramatic women, not violent women, certainly not glamorous women. The truly dangerous sort were those who spent years pouring tea, keeping accounts, and enduring humiliation silently until endurance hardened into purpose. Once such women decided upon action, they frequently became terrifyingly practical. The realization concerning Mrs. Pritchard came to Miss Marple with that peculiar certainty, which arrives not from evidence alone, but from accumulated human observation. The slightly too careful manner, the refusal to discuss her past, and above all the way Charles Valentine had always seemed faintly uneasy in her presence. Not guilty exactly, wary, as men often were around women who remembered too much. The following morning Miss Marple visited the small cottage Mrs. Pritchard rented near the old forge. A thin rain drifted across the village. Smoke rose from chimneys in soft grey ribbons. Somewhere nearby a wireless played dance music faintly and sadly. Mrs. Pritchard opened the door herself. She was a plain woman in her late 50s with greying hair and extraordinarily composed eyes. Upon seeing Miss Marple she did not appear surprised. "I thought perhaps you'd come," she said quietly. Miss Marple entered. The cottage was neat to the point of severity. Everything precisely arranged, everything controlled. Rooms often resembled the emotional lives of their owners. "You knew Charles Valentine before he became Alistair Wren," said Miss Marple gently. Mrs. Pritchard closed the door. "You were his wife." No denial, no performance, only exhaustion. Miss Marple sat carefully beside the fire. Miss Marple sat carefully beside the fire. "My dear," she said softly, "I think you had better tell me everything." For a long moment Mrs. Pritchard remained standing motionless. Then, quite unexpectedly, she laughed, not pleasantly. "You know," she said, "I used to think he feared prison most." "And he did not?" "No." Her face hardened faintly. "Charles feared being ordinary." Miss Marple waited. "He was charming," Mrs. Pritchard continued. "Men admired him. Women trusted him. He always believed rules existed for smaller people. At first it was little things." She folded her hands tightly together. "Then came the war. The rain tapped softly against the window panes. Charles discovered he had a talent for secrets, moving information, knowing people. A bitter smile touched her mouth. He enjoyed importance enormously, and afterward, he thought he could continue playing dangerous games. Her voice dropped lower. But men like Hayter were not playing. Miss Marple nodded. Men like Hayter belonged to that cold, bureaucratic world where loyalty shifted quietly behind polite conversation. And Marcus? Marcus tried to help him once. This surprised Miss Marple. Help him? Marcus wanted Charles to surrender the documents years ago. She shook her head faintly. But Charles kept them hidden instead. As insurance. Miss Marple looked at her steadily. And when Charles returned here as Alistair Wren? Mrs. Pritchard gave a small, helpless gesture. I followed him. Why? Because I wanted to know whether he had changed. Had he? The answer came immediately. No. Silence settled between them. Then Miss Marple asked very quietly, You poisoned him? Mrs. Pritchard closed her eyes. Yes. No hysteria, no denial. Merely truth at last. Miss Marple felt not triumph but sadness, because the woman before her did not resemble a murderess in the theatrical sense. She resembled thousands of respectable Englishwomen who had survived disappointment by becoming emotionally invisible. How? Miss Marple asked gently. He drank sherry every afternoon before dinner. Mrs. Pritchard's voice remained calm. I prepared the tray, and that evening I overheard him speaking with Marcus at the fete. Her hands tightened slightly. I realized everything was beginning again. More lies, more danger. So you decided? Yes. Miss Marple looked toward the fire thoughtfully. Not because of the documents. No, not revenge. Mrs. Pritchard hesitated. Partly revenge, perhaps. One cannot live 20 years beside deceit without bitterness. Then she said quietly, but mostly exhaustion. Miss Marple understood that perfectly. There existed a form of despair deeper than hatred. The despair of knowing someone would never become better. And Lydia Harrow? Charles ruined her too. I thought if he died, Mrs. Pritchard swallowed painfully, perhaps all the fear would finally stop. Miss Marple sighed softly. But fear rarely ends neatly. No. A long silence followed. Then Miss Marple asked the question that mattered most. Did Dr. Hayter know? Mrs. Pritchard looked startled. No. Did he suspect? I don't think so. Miss Marple nodded. That explained the confusion afterward. Hayter had arrived intending retrieval. Instead he discovered Charles already dead, and adapted instantly. Practical men always adapted. What happened after the poisoning? I left the tray and went home. Mrs. Pritchard stared into the fire. Later I heard shouting from the house. Then the police. The glass, said Miss Marple softly. You placed it in his left hand afterward. Mrs. Pritchard looked genuinely shocked. How did you know? Because women tidy things unconsciously, even crime scenes. To her surprise, tears suddenly filled the other woman's eyes. I only wanted it to look peaceful, she whispered. That, Miss Marple thought sadly, was perhaps the most terrible sentence of all. Inspector Slack reacted badly. Good God, he said when Miss Marple finished. You mean we've got 2 murderers? Not cooperating murderers, Miss Marple pointed out. The inspector paced furiously around the vicarage study. This is madness. Merely humanity. Slack stopped abruptly. Hayter kills Brewer, threatens Ellis, hunts the documents, while Mrs. Pritchard independently poisons Valentine beforehand. Quite. And none of them knew precisely what the others were doing. Very few people ever do, said Miss Marple gently. That is why life becomes so untidy. Colonel Melchett looked deeply offended by the entire affair. Woman seemed perfectly respectable. She was, said Miss Marple. The colonel blinked. She poisoned a man. Yeah. Respectable people frequently do dreadful things after years of endurance. Slack groaned aloud. I shall never write this report. You will, said Miss Marple kindly, though probably with omissions. The inspector gave her a sharp look. You disapprove. My dear inspector, governments and policemen both depend rather heavily upon selective truth. Before Slack could answer, a constable appeared breathlessly at the doorway. So Dr. Hayter's gone. Silence crashed into the room. Slack turned white. What? He escaped custody during transfer. For one instant nobody moved. Then Miss Marple said quietly, He's going back to Rosebank Cottage. Slack stared. Why? The microfilm. But we already recovered it. Yes, said Miss Marple softly. Which means he's after something else now. And suddenly she knew exactly what it was. Not documents, not evidence. The only remaining loose end. Inspector Slack's motorcar skidded alarmingly along the rain-slick lane towards St. Mary Mead, while Colonel Melchett clung to the door-handle with military disapproval. Miss Marple sat in the rear seat perfectly composed. "I still don't see why you insisted on coming," Slack muttered. "My dear Inspector, when one has spent several days solving murders, it seems discourteous not to attend the conclusion." The inspector said something under his breath about elderly ladies. Outside, the village drifted past beneath gathering dusk. Lamps glowed faintly behind curtains. Smoke thickened above cottage roofs. The ordinary peace of St. Mary Mead seemed almost offensive now, considering the amount of concealed violence it had apparently harbored. Yet Miss Marple knew villages were always like that. Quiet places merely taught people to hide disturbance more carefully. As they reached the high street, Jimmy Coral came racing toward them on his bicycle. Inspector! Slack braked sharply. "What is it?" "The church," gasped Jimmy breathlessly. "I saw a man go up the bell tower." Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly. Of course. Isolation. And only one reason for Hayter to seek such a place. Observation. "He's watching the village," she said quietly. Slack stared. "For Ellis?" "Yes." The inspector swore softly and accelerated toward the churchyard. St. Mary Mead Church rose dark against the evening sky, ancient and watchful above the mist. The bell tower loomed over crooked gravestones silvered by damp rainlight. Slack leapt from the motor car. "Stay here." Miss Marple ignored him immediately. The church door stood open. Inside, candlelight flickered faintly before the altar. The smell of wet stone and old wood filled the air, and from above came the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Colonel Melchett whispered, "Good Lord!" The narrow spiral staircase wound steeply upward into darkness. Slack drew his revolver. "Careful." Miss Marple followed at a measured pace several steps behind. The climb seemed endless. Stone walls pressed close. Dust drifted faintly from ancient beams overhead. Somewhere above them a bell rope creaked gently. Then came a voice. "Stay where you are." Slack halted instantly. "Drop the gun, Hayter." "No." Miss Marple emerged finally onto the small platform beneath the bells. Dr. Hayter stood near the open tower arch, revolver in hand. Beside him, bound tightly to a wooden chair, sat Ellis, terrified. Hayter's face looked thinner now, stripped of civilized charm by exhaustion and desperation. "You've complicated things unnecessarily," he said coldly. "That," replied Miss Marple mildly, "has been said repeatedly this week." Hayter ignored her. "Ellis saw too much." The servant shook visibly. "I never told anybody, sir, I swear." "You intended to eventually." "No!" Hayter's expression remained perfectly calm. That calmness frightened Miss Marple more than anger would have done. Cold men killed efficiently. "You murdered Brewer," said Slack sharply. "And Valentine." A flicker crossed Hayter's face. Not guilt. Annoyance. "No." Miss Marple watched him carefully. Even now he objected most strongly to the wrong accusation. "You discovered Valentine already dead," she said quietly. Hayter glanced at her, and decided to use the confusion. "Yes." "You searched for the microfilm, and failed." His mouth tightened bitterly. "Charles always enjoyed little theatrical games." The bell shifted softly overhead in the wind. Miss Marple said, "You worked with him once." "For my sins." "You hated him." Hayter laughed shortly. Hatred requires respect. Something in that answer chilled her. Contempt was often more dangerous than hatred. "You poisoned Brewer too?" asked Slack. "I shot him." Hayter sounded almost impatient. "Poison is a woman's method." Miss Marple saw Slack glance sharply toward her. He understood now, at least partly. Hayter continued, "Ellis took the wrong coat and panicked after Brewer died. He hid before I could question him properly. Ellis cried out suddenly, 'I didn't know what any of it meant.'" "No," said Hayter. "Which was why you became inconvenient." The revolver shifted slightly toward Ellis. Slack raised his own gun instantly. "Don't be a fool." A tense silence filled the tower. Wind moaned faintly through the stone arches. Then Miss Marple spoke softly. "You are tired, Dr. Hayter." His eyes flicked toward her irritably. "All this running, all this fear." She folded her hands calmly. "And after so many years, too." Something altered in his expression. Not weakness exactly, but age. For the first time he looked old. "We were told it mattered," he said quietly. No one answered. The war, the secrets, the names. His voice had become strangely distant. Men died because of mistakes. Yes, said Miss Marple gently, and afterward they expected us simply to forget. The revolver lowered very slightly. You couldn't, she said. No. Miss Marple knew suddenly that he had lived too long among shadows and divided loyalties. Men like Hayter often survived crises only to become permanently incapable of ordinary humanity afterward. Danger had become their natural climate. You could stop now, she said quietly. He looked at her almost curiously. Could I? Before anyone could answer, Ellis suddenly lurched sideways in the chair, knocking against the bell rope beside him. A great bell exploded overhead with deafening violence. The sound crashed through the tower like physical force. Hayter flinched instinctively. Slack moved instantly. 2 shots rang out almost simultaneously, then silence, except for the bell still swinging wildly above them. Miss Marple pressed one hand against her chest. The echo rolled endlessly through the tower and out across the dark village below. When the smoke cleared, Hayter sat collapsed against the stone wall, his revolver fallen beside him. But finished. Inspector Slack lowered his weapon slowly. Ellis began sobbing uncontrollably in the chair. And Miss Marple, looking down through the tower arch toward the peaceful lights of St. Mary Mead below, thought how extraordinarily strange it was that human wickedness could exist so persistently among rose gardens and parish councils. Later that night, after statements and confusion and exhausted policemen, Miss Marple finally returned home. The village lay quiet once more beneath soft, drifting rain. Florence met her at the door anxiously. "Oh, miss, are you all right?" "Yes, thank you." "And the murderer?" Miss Marple removed her gloves slowly. "Which one?" Florence stared. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "That," she said, "has been the difficulty all along." Faintly. "That," she said, "has been the difficulty all along." She sat afterward beside the fire with tea growing cold in her hands. Mrs. Pritchard had confessed peacefully. Hayter would live to face trial. Marcus had vanished again into whatever shadowed world had produced him. And Charles Valentine lay dead at the center of it all, charming, frightened, dishonest Charles Valentine, whose greatest talent had been persuading different people to fear different things. Outside, rain whispered softly against the windows. Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly. Yet one question still troubled her. Not about murder, about the umbrella. Why had Charles insisted Lydia carry it publicly through the fete before bringing it to him? Why risk exposure so theatrically? And then suddenly she understood. Not concealment, recognition. Charles had wanted someone to see it, someone connected to the hidden compartment, someone he hoped would reveal themselves by reacting. And it had worked, because Marcus had approached him afterward in fear, which meant Charles Valentine, even at the end, had still been playing dangerous games with dangerous people. Miss Marple sighed softly. Men so often mistook cleverness for safety, and somewhere in the darkness beyond the village, a train whistle sounded faintly across the countryside like something leaving forever behind it only secrets and rain. 3 days later, St. Mary Mead resumed normality with determined enthusiasm. This was not because the village had forgotten the murders. On the contrary, it discussed little else. But English villages possessed a remarkable instinct for absorbing catastrophe into routine. People still required bread from the bakery, flowers for the church altar, and reasons to disapprove of one another. Murder merely added texture to conversation. At Gossington Hall, Mrs. Bantry held tea for a carefully selected group of guests under the pretense of restoring morale. In reality, she wished to hear everything again from the beginning. "My dear Jane," she declared as cucumber sandwiches circulated, "you cannot imagine how disappointed everyone is that there wasn't an international conspiracy after all." "There was," said Miss Marple mildly. "Yes, but it turned out so domestic in the middle." Colonel Melchette snorted into his teacup. "Woman poisons husband, intelligence fellow shoots accomplice, servant hides in terror." "Not accomplice," Miss Marple corrected gently. "Brewer was trying to recover the microfilm independently." The colonel waved this away. "All the same, one expects spies to behave more elegantly." Mrs. Bantry nodded. "Exactly. It ought to have involved coded telegrams on trains." "Instead," said Miss Marple, "it involved frightened, middle-aged people making poor decisions in drawing-rooms, which is considerably more realistic." The French windows stood open onto the late afternoon garden. Roses nodded softly in warm September sunlight. Bees drifted lazily among lavender borders. It was difficult in such surroundings to believe that only days earlier the village bell tower had echoed with gunfire. Mrs. Bantry leaned forward eagerly. "But tell us honestly, Jane, when did you first suspect Mrs. Pritchard?" Miss Marple considered. "The moment I realized the poisoned glass had been placed in the wrong hand." Colonel Melchett looked blank. "The left-hand business again. My dear Colonel, people preserve habits even in chaos. A right-handed man does not ordinarily die clutching a glass in his left hand unless someone arranges him afterward." Mrs. Bantry shivered delightedly. "How sinister!" "No," said Miss Marple softly. "Merely sad." There was a brief silence, because sadness, unlike sinister things, tended to make people uncomfortable. The Colonel cleared his throat. "And Hayter?" "Dr. Hayter interested me because he was too composed." Mrs. Bantry blinked. "But doctors are composed. Yet there are different kinds of composure." Miss Marple stirred her tea gently. "Doctor Haydock possesses the calmness of a man accustomed to illness. Hayter possessed the calmness of a man accustomed to danger." Colonel Melchett nodded reluctantly. "I still say government work ruins people." "That depends," said Miss Marple. "Some people are ruined long before governments discover them useful." Mrs. Bantry sighed happily. "My dear Jane, you always make murder sound like bad housekeeping. In many ways it is. Secrets accumulate. Resentments gather dust. Eventually something poisonous leaks." The others regarded this thoughtfully. Then Mrs. Bantry said, "And Marcus?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Marcus belongs to a category of Englishmen I have encountered before." "What category?" "The kind who survive unpleasant wars and thereafter spend the remainder of life walking quietly through railway stations without luggage." The Colonel laughed loudly. "Damned mysterious fellow." "Not really. Merely careful." "And gone entirely now?" Miss Marple did not add that she suspected Marcus would remain alive precisely because he understood fear properly. Unlike Charles Valentine. Later, as twilight softened the gardens, Miss Marple walked slowly home alone. The village seemed gentler again now that excitement had begun fading into memory. Children played near the green. A dog barked somewhere behind the post office. Smoke drifted upward from cottage chimneys into pale evening sky. Near the church gate she encountered Lydia Harrow standing quietly among the gravestones. The younger woman looked tired but calmer. "They buried him this morning," she said. Lydia glanced toward the churchyard. "I thought I ought to come." Miss Marple nodded. One always felt obliged to bury the dead properly even when they had behaved abominably in life. "Will you stay in St. Mary Mead?" Miss Marple asked. "No. I think villagers remember too well." "Yes," said Miss Marple. "They do." For a moment they stood silently together. Then Lydia said softly, "Did he ever love anyone?" Miss Marple considered carefully before answering. "Charles Valentine loved admiration very deeply." The younger woman lowered her eyes. "That isn't the same thing." "No." A bell rang faintly inside the church. Evening service. Lydia drew a long breath. "I spent years being afraid of him. And now suddenly it's over." She sounded bewildered. "I don't know what to do with that." Miss Marple looked at her kindly. "My dear, freedom is often rather confusing at first." Lydia laughed unexpectedly. Then, after thanking her quietly, she walked away down the lane toward the station road. Miss Marple watched her go thoughtfully. Fear changed people, sometimes into victims, sometimes into killers, and occasionally into survivors. That evening Florence brought in the post with unusual importance. "There's a letter for you, miss. Foreign stamp." Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles. The envelope bore no return address. Inside lay only a single sheet of paper, 3 lines typed neatly. "The material recovered from Rosebank Cottage will cause no further trouble. You were kinder than was wise." Miss Marple smiled faintly. Marcus, how very like a man accustomed to secrets to send anonymous gratitude. She folded the letter carefully into the fire. Certain things, she felt, belonged better to silence. Outside, wind stirred softly through the autumn garden. And somewhere beyond St. Mary Mead, trains continued carrying strangers toward new lives, old fears, and the endless complicated business of human deception. By October, the affair of Rosebank Cottage had already begun its transformation into village legend. This happened surprisingly quickly in St. Mary Mead. Facts softened at the edges. Details rearranged themselves. Certain conversations became longer and cleverer in recollection than they had ever been in reality. Within a fortnight, at least 3 villagers claimed to have suspected espionage from the beginning. while Mrs. Finch at the post office confidently informed customers that she had noticed foreign tendencies in Alistair Wren's handwriting months earlier. Miss Marple allowed these revisions peacefully. Human memory, she knew, was less concerned with truth than comfort. The autumn mornings grew colder. Leaves gathered damply along the lanes. Smoke scented the evening air. Village life folded itself gradually inward toward winter habits, fires, knitting, and long conversations conducted beside tea-trays. And yet, despite the apparent conclusion of everything, one small question continued quietly troubling Miss Marple. Not the murders, those she understood. Not the espionage. Governments had always seemed to her merely another form of village committee, though with better tailoring and deadlier consequences. Number. The thing that remained with her was the umbrella itself. One afternoon, nearly 3 weeks after Hayter's arrest, Miss Marple sat beside her drawing-room fire while Inspector Slack paid what he termed an informal visit, though he carried enough official papers to suggest otherwise. "You were right, by the way," he announced reluctantly. "How gratifying." Hayter admitted Valentine used the umbrella as a signal. Miss Marple looked up. "He arranged with Marcus years ago that if danger ever became serious, he'd send the umbrella through an intermediary." Slack frowned. "What I still don't understand is why nobody simply opened the blasted thing earlier." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "My dear Inspector, because people very seldom investigate familiar objects." "What does that mean?" "It means," said Miss Marple patiently, "that umbrellas belong to a category of things one notices without examining." Slack looked unconvinced. "Like what?" "Oh, hearthrugs, church hassocks, elderly companions." She resumed knitting serenely. "People cease truly observing what appears ordinary." The inspector considered this. Charles Valentine understood that perfectly. The umbrella was ideal precisely because nobody would think it interesting. Miss Marple sighed softly. "My dear Inspector, old ladies are generally ignored for exactly the same reason umbrellas are." Slack stared at her a moment. Then, unexpectedly, he laughed. "I'll say one thing for you, Miss Marple, you notice things." "Yes," she agreed gently. "Unfortunately." A silence followed while rain whispered against the windows. Then Slack cleared his throat awkwardly. "There's another matter." "Yes?" "Mrs. Pritchard." Miss Marple's knitting slowed. "She's ill. Doctor says strain brought on a collapse." Miss Marple nodded sadly. She had expected as much. People sometimes survived unhappiness for years only to break once truth finally arrived. "She asked after you," Slack added. "Did she?" "She said." The inspector hesitated. "She said you were the first person who looked at her as though she was still human." Miss Marple lowered her eyes briefly. Poor woman. There was nothing more terrible than becoming invisible through suffering. 2 days later, Miss Marple visited the small nursing home near Much Benham where Mrs. Pritchard had been taken. The woman looked older now, smaller somehow, as though confession had drained the final force holding her upright. Yet when she saw Miss Marple, relief softened her tired face. "I hoped you'd come." Miss Marple sat beside the bed. "How are you feeling?" "Yes," said Miss Marple quietly. "That happens sometimes afterward." Mrs. Pritchard stared toward the rain-gray window. "I keep thinking about ordinary things." "Ordinary things are generally the most important. I remember polishing Charles's shoes once before the war." A faint, bewildered smile touched her mouth. "Such a silly thing to remember." "No." The woman's fingers tightened slightly against the blanket. "I thought hating him would feel larger somehow." Miss Marple said gently, "Hatred is exhausting. It rarely feels grand when it finishes." Mrs. Pritchard closed her eyes. "I didn't mean to become that sort of woman." "No one ever does." For a while neither spoke. Then Mrs. Pritchard whispered, "Do you think God forgives people like me?" Miss Marple considered carefully. "My dear," she said at last, "I think God understands people far better than villagers do." Tears slipped silently down the woman's face. Miss Marple took her hand briefly. Not absolution, not judgment, merely human companionship. Sometimes that was all one could honestly offer. That evening Miss Marple returned home through drifting autumn mist. The church bells rang softly across the darkening village. Children's voices echoed faintly from distant cottages. Somewhere a gate banged in the wind. Ordinary life continued. It always did. At her garden gate she paused unexpectedly. Something rested beside the hedge. An umbrella, old-fashioned, carefully furled. Miss Marple stared at it for several seconds before bending slowly to examine the handle. No hidden compartment, no secret mechanism. only an ordinary umbrella left accidentally by some absent-minded passer-by. Yet she found herself smiling faintly, because suddenly she understood why the affair had disturbed her so deeply from the beginning. Not because of espionage, not because of murder, because the umbrella represented the entire tragedy perfectly. Something outwardly harmless carried silently from hand to hand while everyone politely pretended not to notice its hidden weight. Secrets worked very much the same way. Families carried them, villages carried them, nations certainly carried them, and most people avoided opening them because they suspected deep down that once opened, nothing inside would ever fold neatly away again. Miss Marple picked up the umbrella carefully and carried it home through the mist. Inside, Florence looked up from laying the supper tray. "Someone forget their umbrella, miss?" "Yes," said Miss Marple softly. She paused beside the firelight, her gentle old face thoughtful in the warm glow. "Yes," she repeated. "I believe someone did." Winter arrived early that year. By mid-November the hedges glittered white with frost each morning, and St. Mary Mead settled into the subdued rhythm peculiar to English villages, in cold weather curtains drawn early, bicycles muffled in mist, and conversations conducted close to fireplaces as though warmth itself encouraged confidence. The affair of Rosebank Cottage had begun, outwardly at least, to fade. Dr. Hayter awaited trial in London under circumstances the newspapers described vaguely and at great length. Marcus remained invisible. Lydia Harrow had written once from Bath, briefly and gratefully. Mrs. Pritchard lingered quietly in the nursing home between recovery and resignation. And Charles Valentine was becoming a story. That, Miss Marple reflected sadly, was the final transformation awaiting everyone eventually. Not death. Narrative. One evening shortly before Christmas, she sat with Mrs. Bantry beside the fire at Gossington Hall while snow drifted softly beyond the windows. "My dear Jane," Mrs. Bantry declared, "I still cannot reconcile myself to Mrs. Pritchard." "No? She looks so ordinary." Miss Marple smiled faintly over her teacup. "Dolly, almost everyone looks ordinary." Mrs. Bantry considered this with mild alarm. "Well, it's rather unsettling when you put it that way." The drawing-room glowed warmly with lamplight and polished silver. Somewhere deeper in the house servants moved faintly about preparing dinner. Mrs. Bantry sighed luxuriously. "One likes murderers to appear dramatic." "Yes," said Miss Marple. "Unfortunately, they often resemble maiden aunts." "My dear." "Or churchwardens," added Miss Marple thoughtfully. Mrs. Bantry laughed. "Now you're being wicked." Merely observant. For a while they watched the snow fall quietly. Then Mrs. Bantry said, "Do you know what troubled me most?" "What?" "That poor woman waited 20 years, and all that time she still hoped he might become different." Miss Marple set down her teacup gently. "That is the saddest habit human beings possess," she said softly. "Believing character improves merely because time passes." Mrs. Bantry looked unusually thoughtful. "You think people never change?" "Ah, they change constant." "But rarely in the direction others deserve." The room fell silent again. Outside, snow thickened softly across the lawns. Then Mrs. Bantry brightened suddenly. "Well, at least the umbrella business is finished forever." Miss Marple's expression altered almost imperceptibly. "Perhaps. My dear, don't tell me you're still thinking about it." "I was thinking," said Miss Marple slowly, "about Charles Valentine's final mistake." "What was that?" "He believed hidden things remained controllable." Mrs. Bantry blinked. "I don't understand." Miss Marple folded her hands. "Secrets alter once shared. Fear alters once spread. Charles imagined he could preserve danger neatly inside compartments like papers in a desk." She shook her head gently. "But hidden things leak into people's lives." Mrs. Bantry shivered slightly despite the fire. "Really, Jane?" "Yes," said Miss Marple. "It is rather unpleasant." A week later, Inspector Slack visited unexpectedly carrying a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. "For you," he announced. How mysterious. Cleared through official channels, apparently. He sounded faintly annoyed by official channels in general. Miss Marple unwrapped the parcel carefully. Inside lay the umbrella. The original one, black silk worn smooth with age, curved wooden handle polished by years of use. She looked up. "I thought it had been retained." "So did I." Then suddenly London decided it was no longer materially significant. Slack snorted. "Government fellows." Probably relieved the whole thing disappeared quietly. Miss Marple ran her fingers lightly over the handle. "How very foolish." "Why?" "To imagine anything disappears quietly." The inspector settled himself near the fire. You know, Hayter still insists he never intended to kill Valentine originally. Did he? Says he only came to recover the microfilm. Miss Marple nodded. That is probably true. Slack looked dissatisfied. You're extraordinarily charitable toward murderers. No, she corrected gently. Merely realistic. Most people do not begin intending murder. They simply continue making smaller selfish decisions until murder becomes convenient. The inspector frowned thoughtfully. Miss Marple examined the umbrella again. Such an innocent object, yet how many lives had bent themselves around it? Fear, betrayal, exhaustion, greed, and perhaps most tragically of all, hope. Inspector, she said suddenly, did anyone ever determine why Charles Valentine scratched Dr. Hayter's face from the photograph? Slack looked surprised. Why? Because hatred leaves traces, the inspector shrugged. Perhaps he blamed Hayter for something during the war. Perhaps, but Miss Marple did not think so. Charles Valentine had feared Hayter. Fear scratched photographs more often than hatred did. That night, after the inspector departed, Miss Marple remained awake longer than usual. The umbrella rested beside her chair. The house had grown very quiet. Wind murmured faintly outside among bare branches. At last she rose and carried the umbrella to the small escritoire near the window. Carefully, very carefully, she unscrewed the handle once more. The compartment inside lay empty, or almost empty. Miss Marple frowned. Something tiny remained caught deep within the narrow hollow. She tilted the umbrella gently. A folded scrap of paper slipped into her palm. For several seconds she simply stared at it. Then she unfolded it slowly. Only 2 words appeared, written in faded pencil. Trust Marcus. Nothing else. No explanation. Novate. Miss Marple sat very still, because suddenly one final possibility emerged quietly from the shadows of everything she had believed resolved. What if Charles Valentine had not merely feared Marcus? What if, at the very end, Marcus had been the only person he truly trusted? The wind rattled softly against the windows. Miss Marple refolded the paper carefully and returned it to the hidden compartment. Some truth, she thought, arrived too late to alter anything at all. And perhaps that was mercy. Christmas came to St. Mary Mead beneath deep snow and a sky the color of pearl. The village church glowed warmly through frosted darkness each evening. Carol voices drifted across the green. Holly appeared upon cottage doors, and every household resumed the annual English tradition of pretending winter festivities were effortless despite visible exhaustion. Miss Marple observed these things peacefully. She had always thought Christmas revealed human nature with particular clarity. Kind people became kinder. Tiresome people became unbearable. Lonely people suffered bravely in silence while cheerful relatives discussed pudding. And beneath it all lay the persistent determination of ordinary life to continue. On Christmas Eve, Mrs. Bantry insisted upon bringing a basket of mince pies and unnecessary gossip to Miss Marple's cottage. "My dear Jane," she announced while removing snowy overshoes, "you are not to spend the evening alone looking philosophical." "I seldom look philosophical intentionally." "Nonsense. You've had your thoughtful expression for days." Miss Marple smiled faintly. The fire burned brightly. Candlelight softened the small sitting room into gold and shadow. Outside, snow fell steadily across the sleeping village. Mrs. Bantry accepted tea eagerly. "I still say the whole affair was far too complicated. Life generally is. But really secret compartments, intelligence men, poison, false identities." Mrs. Bantry shook her head. "One could hardly invent such things." "My dear Dolly," said Miss Marple gently, "people always imagine wickedness must be exotic. In reality it usually begins with very ordinary weaknesses, such as loneliness, resentment. She adjusted the teapot thoughtfully. "Those 4 alone account for a remarkable proportion of human trouble." Mrs. Bantry laughed. "You make murder sound like a parish committee. There is often considerable overlap." For a while they sat comfortably listening to the wind outside. Then Mrs. Bantry said quietly, "Do you pity Charles Valentine?" Miss Marple considered before answering. Mrs. Bantry looked surprised. "Even after everything? My dear, charm is a dangerous gift in weak people." Miss Marple's voice remained soft. "Charles Valentine spent his life escaping consequences rather than character. Eventually the two became impossible to separate." Mrs. Bantry frowned slightly. "That sounds terribly sad." "And Mrs. Pritchard?" Miss Marple's knitting slowed. "She is sadder still." "Because she killed him?" "No. Miss Marple looked into the fire. Because she loved him long after she understood him. The room fell silent. Snow brushed softly against the windows like fingertips. Then Mrs. Bantry said, "You know, Jane, I've been thinking about that umbrella." "Have you?" "It's odd, really. Everyone kept carrying it about, but no one wanted to open it." Miss Marple smiled gently. "Yes, almost as though they already knew something dreadful was inside." "Yes," repeated Miss Marple quietly. "People often know?" Mrs. Bantry blinked. "What do you mean?" But before Miss Marple could answer, the church bells began ringing across the snowy dark. Midnight service. The sound drifted beautifully over the village roofs. Mrs. Bantry rose reluctantly. "Well, I must go and pretend to enjoy carols. You generally do enjoy them." "Yes, but I dislike appearing predictable." At the door she paused. "My dear Jane?" "Yes?" "You really do understand people rather alarmingly well." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "My dear Dolly, one merely observes—" After Mrs. Bantry departed, Miss Marple remained alone beside the fire. The umbrella stood once more near the hall stand. Ordinary, unremarkable, harmless-looking. She thought about Charles Valentine's hidden note. Trust Marcus. Perhaps he had meant it sincerely. Perhaps not. One could never entirely trust the final gestures of frightened men. Yet she found herself hoping it had been genuine, because redemption, however partial, deserved acknowledgment when it appeared. The clock chimed midnight softly. Outside the bells continued ringing through snow and darkness. Miss Marple rose slowly and crossed to the window. St. Mary Mead lay peaceful beneath winter silence. Smoke drifted upward from sleeping cottages. Lamplight glowed amber through curtained windows. Somewhere far off came the faint laughter of young people returning home through snow-covered lanes. Ordinary life, fragile. Human beings, Miss Marple reflected, were extraordinarily poor at understanding themselves. They concealed motives beneath politeness, disguised fear as anger, confused possession with love, and called selfishness by prettier names whenever possible. Yet despite all that, they continued setting tables, tending gardens, raising children, and singing hymns at Christmas. It was, she thought, rather admirable. Her gaze rested finally upon the umbrella once more. No one had opened it because everyone feared what opening it might require them to know. That, perhaps, was true not merely of umbrellas, but of people. Miss Marple drew the curtains gently against the snow, and in the quiet warmth of her little cottage, while Christmas bells echoed softly across the sleeping village, peace at last returned to St. Mary Mead. The first week of January arrived wrapped in bitter cold. Frost silvered the hedges each morning, and the ponds beyond St. Mary Mead froze hard enough for reckless boys to test them despite every maternal warning in the village. The excitement surrounding the Rosebank cottage affair had diminished now into something gentler and more reflective, less scandal than memory. Only occasionally did the subject return sharply to life. A stranger asking directions, a newspaper mention of Hayter's coming trial, or the sight of the black umbrella still standing quietly beside Miss Marple's hall table. On a grey afternoon shortly after Twelfth Night, Miss Marple sat writing letters when Florence entered with mild surprise upon her face. "There's a gentleman to see you, miss." "A gentleman?" "Yes, miss." "Foreign-looking." Miss Marple laid down her pen calmly. "One always distrusts that description in English villages, Florence. It generally means the person has polished shoes." Florence looked uncertain whether this was criticism. The visitor waited in the drawing-room. Marcus. He stood near the fire, hat in hand, his dark coat dusted faintly with melting snow. In daylight and peace he appeared older than before, not dangerous exactly, but worn thin by years of caution. "You came back," said Miss Marple. "You are either brave or foolish." A faint smile touched his face. "I wanted to thank you properly." "That is rarely wise." "No." He glanced toward the umbrella by the doorway. "But some debts become tiresome." Miss Marple motioned him toward a chair. "Then perhaps you had better sit down before becoming honorable." He laughed quietly at that. For several moments neither spoke. Outside, wind rattled softly through the bare branches beyond the garden. At last Marcus said, "You found the note?" "Charles wrote it years ago." "I suspected as much." Marcus stared into the fire. He believed eventually someone would come for the microfilm. They did. "Yes." A tired shadow crossed his expression. "Charles always imagined danger made him important." Miss Marple regarded him steadily. "And did it?" "No," Marcus answered immediately. "It merely made him lonely." Silence settled between them. Then Miss Marple asked quietly, "Did you ever intend to betray him?" Marcus looked genuinely surprised. "No." "Even after all the trouble he caused?" "He was weak," Marcus said simply. "Not evil." Miss Marple thought about that carefully. It was true, perhaps. Charles Valentine had ruined lives, lied habitually, manipulated affection, and hidden dangerous secrets for selfish reasons. Yet true evil required a colder quality, a willingness to destroy without remorse. That had belonged to Hayter instead. "You tried to save him," she said. Marcus nodded once. "Too late." He glanced toward her. "You pity him. A little. You shouldn't." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "My dear sir, pity is not endorsement. Merely recognition." Marcus seemed about to reply, then stopped. For the first time she noticed how tired he truly looked, not physically, morally, like a man who had spent too long carrying memories no one else could safely know. At length he reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a small envelope. "For you." Miss Marple accepted it cautiously. Inside lay an old photograph. 3 younger men stood together beside a military car somewhere abroad during the war. Charles Valentine smiled brilliantly at the camera. Marcus looked grim and uncomfortable, and beside them stood Dr. Hayter, younger, sharper, his expression unreadable even then. On the back someone had written in faded ink, "To Charlie, who always lands on his feet." Miss Marple studied it thoughtfully. "How tragic," she murmured. Marcus looked up. "What is?" "That they were all wrong." He understood instantly. "Yes." The fire crackled softly between them. Then Marcus rose. "I won't trouble St. Mary Mead again." "My dear," said Miss Marple gently, "trouble rarely announces its intentions." For the first time genuine amusement lit his face. "You really do understand people." "No," she corrected softly. "Only patterns." At the door he paused. "One question." "Yes?" "Why did the umbrella matter to you so much?" Miss Marple considered. "Because," she said at last, "everyone treated it as ordinary while being secretly afraid of it." Marcus was silent. Then he nodded slowly. "Yes," he said, "that's exactly right." And with that he stepped out into the fading winter afternoon and was gone. That evening Miss Marple sat alone beside the fire, turning the old photograph thoughtfully between her fingers. 3 men, 1 dead, 1 imprisoned, 1 vanished again into shadows, and all of them in different ways destroyed by fear. The village outside had already moved onward. Tomorrow there would be church meetings, butcher's bills, garden plans for spring. Ordinary concerns would reclaim their rightful place. Yet Miss Marple knew something remained. Yet Miss Marple knew something remained behind after every tragedy. Not ghosts exactly, but impressions, warnings, little reminders hidden quietly inside ordinary things. Her gaze drifted once more toward the umbrella. Then, very gently, she smiled. At last she rose, carried it to the cupboard beneath the stairs, and closed the door softly upon it. Some secrets, she thought, did not need preserving forever. Outside, snow began falling once more across the peaceful roofs of St. Mary Mead, and in the quiet little cottage with the fire glowing warmly against the winter dark, Miss Jane Marple finally allowed herself to rest. February brought rain. Not dramatic rain, but the persistent English sort that seemed less to fall than to occupy the air indefinitely. The lanes of St. Mary Mead turned soft with mud, gardens lay stripped and waiting beneath grey skies, and everyone developed opinions about dampness as though it were a political issue. Life resumed itself completely. That, Miss Marple reflected, was perhaps humanity's greatest strength, or its greatest blindness. On a wet Thursday afternoon she sat at the Bluebird tea-rooms with Mrs. Bantry, while the village conducted its usual quiet theatre around them, teaspoons clinking, voices lowering for scandal, chairs scraping politely across worn floors. "My dear Jane," Mrs. Bantry announced, "I saw Mrs. Finch this morning pretending she never accused the vicar's nephew of espionage. How sensible of her! She now claims she suspected Mrs. Pritchard all along." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "People prefer memories that flatter their intelligence." Mrs. Bantry buttered a scone thoughtfully. "I still think the whole thing changed the village." "Yes," said Miss Marple quietly. "A little." They both knew it was true. Not visibly. St. Mary Mead still appeared precisely the same tidy cottages, church bells, gossip drifting gently through shop doors. Yet beneath that surface something subtle had altered. People locked doors more carefully now, Strangers were observed longer before being trusted, and occasionally, during pauses in ordinary conversation, one saw flickers of uncertainty pass briefly through familiar faces. Because the village had discovered something uncomfortable, danger did not always arrive from outside. Sometimes it poured tea beside you for years. Mrs. Bantry sighed. I suppose that's what disturbed everyone most. Why? That Mrs. Pritchard seemed so ordinary. Miss Marple stirred her tea slowly. My dear Dolly, ordinary people are capable of extraordinary things. She paused. Both good and bad. At that moment the bell above the tea-room door jingled softly. A young army officer entered out of the rain, tall, dark-haired, walking with the faintest trace of a limp. For one absurd instant the entire room went silent. Miss Marple saw recognition ripple unconsciously across several faces before embarrassment followed immediately afterward. The young man merely removed wet gloves and ordered tea politely, entirely unaware of the effect he had produced. Mrs. Bantry released a tiny breath. How ridiculous we are! Yes, said Miss Marple softly. Fear leaves echoes. That evening Miss Marple received a final letter from London. Brief. Dr. Hayter had pleaded guilty to the murder of Brewer and related charges concerning wartime intelligence operations. Owing to sensitive national considerations, portions of the proceedings would remain sealed indefinitely. Miss Marple read the letter once and placed it quietly into the fire. There seemed little point preserving the final paperwork of human misery. Later, as dusk gathered beyond the windows, Florence entered carrying another envelope. No stamp on this one, miss. Someone left it by the gate. Miss Marple opened it carefully. Inside lay only a single train ticket, London to Dover, unused, and beneath it a note in Marcus's precise handwriting. For some people, leaving is the nearest thing to redemption. Nothing more. Miss Marple looked at the ticket for a long while. Then she smiled sadly. Poor Marcus. Men who survived dangerous worlds often mistook disappearance for peace. Still, perhaps in his case it was enough. She folded the note carefully away rather than burning it. Not all memories require destruction. That night a storm swept across St. Mary Mead. Rain lashed the windows. Wind bent the trees sharply against the darkness. Somewhere distant, thunder rolled across the countryside. Miss Marple sat beside the fire knitting quietly while the umbrella remained hidden beneath the stairs. At last she laid the knitting aside. Very slowly she crossed the room and opened the cupboard door. The umbrella stood exactly where she had placed it. Harmless looking, she touched the curved wooden handle thoughtfully. How strange, she reflected, that so much suffering had gathered itself around such a simple object. Yet perhaps objects merely absorbed what human beings placed inside them. Hope, love distorted into possession, loyalty twisted by war, and exhaustion deep enough to become murder. Miss Marple closed the cupboard again gently. Outside the storm began gradually moving eastward beyond the village. The worst weather, like the worst grief, eventually passed on. She returned to her chair and sat quietly watching the firelight flicker across the small familiar room. St. Mary Mead slept peacefully beyond the rain-dark windows. Tomorrow there would be shopping lists, church committees, minor scandals, and discussions about spring flowers. Life would continue weaving itself stubbornly forward exactly as it always had. And perhaps that was right, because in the end Miss Marple thought evil was rarely defeated dramatically. It was simply outlived by ordinary kindness, ordinary routine, and ordinary people continuing bravely onward despite everything they had learned. The fire settled softly into glowing embers. Miss Jane Marple closed her eyes for a moment, listening to the rain fade slowly into silence. And at last, truly at last, the mystery of the unopened umbrella came to rest.